Welcome. I am Ted McCollum with the Texas AgriLife Extension Service, and today we're going to review the Texas Cattle Feeders Association Beef Safety and Quality Assurance Program. Our intentions are to review the requirements of the program, the objectives of the program, so that employees in the cattle feeding industry, cattle feeders, consumers, and others can better understand the efforts that Texas Cattle Feeders Association is putting forth to ensure food safety in beef cattle that are produced in our member feed yards. Today, more than ever, it is important that producers and members of the food industry ensure and educate consumers about the safety of the food products that we are producing. We have the safest food supply in the world, yet many of our consumers do not have total faith and trust in our efforts to ensure food safety. For instance, in a 2008 Consumer Confidence Survey conducted by the Center for Food Integrity and subsequent surveys conducted by the same organizations, consumers indicated that producers and food companies had primary responsibility for food safety. Not the consumer or others, but the producers and the food companies. In those same surveys, consumers indicated they only had a moderate level of trust that producers were ensuring food safety. This is a concern. And finally, consumers indicated that in the agricultural food industry involving livestock, dairy, pork, beef cattle, and poultry, that producers should be held responsible for proper and humane treatment of the livestock that we use to produce food. They had no issues with consuming meat products or dairy products for food, but they were concerned that the animals used to produce those products were managed and treated properly during the production system. So in order for the beef industry to maintain and improve consumer confidence, we must ensure that the beef we produce is safe, that the beef we produce is of desirable eating quality, and that the cattle that we use to produce that beef are handled and managed properly in our production systems. Over 20 years ago, the National Cattlemen's Association, which is now today the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, initiated the Beef Quality Assurance Program, or BQA program. The intentions of this program were to address food safety and quality issues that were occurring in beef, and also to ensure proper handling and management of cattle used in our production systems. The BQA program applies to all segments of the beef industry, from the cow-calf to the feedlot industry, or segments, and this is a program that is voluntary. The intentions of the beef industry are to have a voluntary program with producer participation to avoid mandatory regulation by our state and federal government entities. In the National Beef Quality Assurance Program, this serves as an umbrella for states and other organizations to develop their own BQA programs for associations, organizations, and producer groups in their states. The BQA guidelines address best management practices that are related to feedstuffs that we use in cattle production, feed additives and medications that we use to ensure health and performance of our livestock, the proper processing and treatment of cattle, the proper use of injectable animal health products in the industry, and finally, proper cattle care and husbandry practices that we should implement on our ranches, farms, and in our feedlots. Texas Cattle Feeders Association program falls under the umbrella of the National Cattlemen Beef Association. The Texas Cattle Feeders program is called the Beef Safety and Quality Assurance Program. This is one of the oldest programs instituted by an association in the United States. The Texas Cattle Feeders were one of the pioneers, if you want, in instituting these programs for their members. The Texas Cattle Feeders program was developed and initiated in 1986. Then in 1996, the program was further updated to use what are called HACCP principles that we will discuss in a moment. And finally, in 2003, the program evolved further and was updated to include animal handling guidelines for the feedlots. The primary intention of the TCFA program is to reduce the chance of introducing biological, chemical, and physical contaminants into the nation's beef supply. Examples of these contaminants would be contamination with bacteria or other organisms that can cause illness in a consumer, chemical contamination such as from pesticides or pharmaceutical products that we use in our production systems, or physical contaminants, for instance, metal such as broken needles, metal shavings, wire, other items that might end up contaminating a beef carcass and end up in a consumer product. In the TCFA program, TCFA feed yards that participate are required to be audited annually by an independent third-party auditor. And this is to ensure that the feed yard is following accepted protocols, maintaining appropriate records. And the TCFA feed yards that participate and successfully complete the annual audits are certified by Texas Cattle Feeders Association. And you can note this on their signage, their letterheads, and their advertisements by the quality seal from the Texas Cattle Feeders Association. As mentioned, in 1996, the TCFA program was updated to include HACCP concepts. HACCP is an acronym for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. And the objective of HACCP is to prevent a problem from occurring rather than dealing with the problem once it has occurred. And if you remember anything about HACCP, it's simply that a HACCP plan is a prevention plan. We want to prevent a problem from occurring rather than have to deal with the problem after it has already occurred. In HACCP, the basic process is that we evaluate production processes. And as we go through the Texas Cattle Feeders Association program, you will see that we go through the process of growing and finishing cattle from the time they arrive at the feedlot till the time they leave the feedlot. It identifies critical control points. And the critical control point is a point where food safety problems might be introduced and therefore controlled or prevented. For instance, there are some food safety concerns that might arise from the use of pharmaceutical products in cattle as we prevent or treat health problems in cattle. Therefore, one of the critical control points where we use those products would be in the processing barn or in the hospital, and maintaining proper records of treatment and proper records of whether there were broken needles occurring and other things. So that would be a critical control point where a food safety issue could be controlled or prevented. In the Texas Cattle Feeders Association, 5 critical control points have been identified in feed yards that are related to producing a safe beef product. And as we go through these, you will note that these all address government regulatory issues dealing with food safety. So as we mentioned the acronym CCP for critical control point, think of safe beef. Also, in the Texas Cattle Feeders program, they have identified 16 quality control points, or QCPs. A QCP is related to producing a quality beef product or more effective management of the feed yard. So when you think about a QCP, think about quality beef or efficient management of the feed yard. In the Texas Cattle Feeders program, the CCPs and QCPs are divided into 3 categories. There are critical control points and quality control points addressing feed sources, addressing cattle, and addressing pharmaceuticals and biologicals that we use in the feed yards. Each critical control point or quality control point has several items associated with it that we will discuss as we move through each one of these individually. First of all would be what is referred to as a critical limit. Basically, a critical limit is a threshold. If you're below that threshold, you're in compliance. If you're above that threshold, you're out of compliance. As an example, broken needles that might remain in an animal after the needle has broken off. The critical limit is 0. There is 0 tolerance for broken needles. Also, we have monitoring procedures. How do we monitor our processes to ensure that we are not introducing a food safety problem or some other issue? These monitoring procedures involve everything from training of employees to oversight of our processes to signatures and verification processes on documents that we will discuss. Third would be records. These records are to document and keep a document to show that we are in compliance and that our processes are in compliance. And finally would be verification steps, where we can go back and verify that our system is in compliance, our production protocols are in compliance. These would include signatures on records and documents, managerial review of our processes, as well as those audits that we mentioned earlier that occur annually in the feedlots. So that's briefly an introduction to the Texas Cattle Feeders Association Beef Safety and Quality Assurance Program. Now we'll progress on in and talk about the critical control points and quality control points in the program. The first group of critical control points and quality control points we will address deal with feed sources that we use in the feedlot or feed yard. Under the feed sources, we have critical control points and quality control points. And as you can see from this schematic, the critical control points would be listed in red and the quality control points would be listed in green. There's critical control points 1 and 3 that we will discuss that come under receiving of feed into the feedlot. There's also 6 quality control points that deal with receiving feedstuffs into the feedlot. Then as we move across from storage to processing to handling and batching and down to the medications, at the medications step, we also have another critical control point that deals with the proper use of medications in our feeds. So those would be the critical control points and quality control points in the schematic on how we handle feed in the feed yard. So as we look through these, we have a critical control point for grain receiving, a critical control point for feed medications, and a critical control point dealing with supplement receiving into the feed yard. So let's move through these. First is grain receiving. The issue on grain receiving, or the hazard, is mycotoxins, and in the case of cattle feeding, our primary concern in terms of mycotoxins would be aflatoxin that would occur in grain. Aflatoxins can create residues in beef, and this is important because the Food and Drug Administration of the U.S. government considers aflatoxins as potential carcinogens for humans. So there are FDA regulations dealing with the amount of aflatoxin that is allowed in feedstuffs for our food animals. In terms of criteria or critical limits that are involved, once again the FDA has published regulations on the amounts of aflatoxin that can occur in grains that are fed to cattle. The maximum legal allowable aflatoxin in grains for finishing beef cattle is 300 parts per billion. In reality, in the Texas Panhandle, we do not deal with a lot of aflatoxins in our grain. In our feed yards in the state of Texas, along the Gulf Coast, aflatoxin is a problem that occurs annually in for many of those feed yards and grain producers in that area of the state. Although 300 parts per billion is the legal limit, many times the consultants for our feed yards are setting the specifications at a much lower level to ensure that the grain coming into the feed yards does not surpass the 300 parts per billion. 4 aflatoxins as far as monitoring procedures that are suggested or required for the feed yards. 1 would be periodic sampling and analysis of grain that are coming into the feedlots. This sampling and analysis may be a weekly sample. This may be a monthly sample depending on the season of the year and what the probability of aflatoxin levels in the grain would be. This may be something that is conducted by the Grain Inspection Service, for instance in Plainview or Amarillo here in the Panhandle of Texas, or this may be grain samples that are collected by the feed yard and then submitted to a commercial lab for testing. So this would be on-site sampling and screening, sampling and laboratory tests, also the supplier information and testing. In some cases they're asking the suppliers of the grain to test the grain and verify and document that the grain meets specifications for the aflatoxin. With aflatoxins, we need to consider corrective or preventative actions. A corrective or preventative action would be an action we would take in the instance that a load of grain that had violative aflatoxin levels was delivered to the feed yard. In reality, with aflatoxins in the feed yard, if we have 1 load of grain come into that feed yard, that load of grain is gone by the next day or before perhaps we have the laboratory analysis on the aflatoxins. This is not a great concern for the cattle or the beef product because that may be 1 load of grain and a very small amount of grain that occurred in a 150 or 160 day feeding period. So our corrective or preventative actions in those cases would be simply to, if that tolerance level is exceeded, let's call up our grain supplier and inform them that we had a problem with that load of grain and work with that supplier to ensure that that problem does not occur again. Suggested records that we look for as we conduct an audit in a feedlot is we look for laboratory reports. Is the feed yard actually sending grain samples in for testing to document or monitor aflatoxin levels in the grain? well, again, laboratory reports, sample results, or in some cases there may be a feed label or tag where the supplier of that grain sent a label or a tag documenting what the aflatoxin level would have been in those loads of grain products. And finally, verification. This would include managerial review of records. Is someone looking at those reports to ensure that the aflatoxin levels in the grain are staying within specifications? And then once again, the sampling and testing of the grain by the feed yard as a check against someone else that may be sampling or providing the documentation for the grain. Our second critical control point dealing with feeds deals with feed medications, antibiotics, other controlled substances that we use in our feeding programs to maintain health and prevent health problems in our cattle. Again, the hazard we would be concerned about here would be tissue residues that would result from the use of these products, and those tissue residues might be the result of exceeding the allowed daily dosage of that feed additive. It may be from misapplication of the feed additive. For instance, we're using a feed medication that all the cattle in the feed yard may not be receiving that feed medication, but there's a mistake where a load of feed is delivered to the wrong pen, and so that feed additive is actually misapplied. In other words, it's delivered to the wrong set of cattle. The managers do not realize that, and perhaps those cattle leave the feed yard and therefore may have not cleared withdrawal periods. So that would be potentially end up with a tissue residue that resulted from, quote, misapplication of that. And finally, improper mixing. Improper mixing would include where the wrong amount of the feed additive may be added in the feed mill, or it could also include mixing times that are not allowing the feed additive to be distributed thoroughly through the feed and therefore delivered at the proper rates to all cattle with that load of feed. Again, criteria, critical limits that we deal with the feed medications is there are labeled dosages. What is the correct amount of that feed additive that should be consumed daily by the cattle? It may deal with potency or concentration. Many of these feed additives are added into our feeds in a grams per ton or milligrams per pound or potency or concentration dosage. Other criteria, critical limits would deal with withdrawal time prior to slaughter of those animals. Are the animals withheld from that feed additive for a long enough period of time for any residues to clear from their system before they are processed? And finally, any good manufacturing practices, tolerance, or manufacturer specifications that might be necessary when we use these feed additives in our feed milling and feed production practices. Monitoring procedures that would be included here would be scheduled equipment maintenance. Are scales working properly? Are scales calibrated properly? Are micro machines delivering the right amount of that feed additive into our feed mixes? Inventory control to monitor usage. Is someone every day checking the inventory levels of our feed additives to ensure that the correct amount for the amount of feed that was mixed that day was utilized? Supplement and feed analysis. This would be spot checking our rations and having a laboratory analysis conducted to see that our additive levels are at the proper concentration in our feeds. Daily feed mill production records, our batching records, inventory records, and other things to indicate that all of our production of feed that day is within our acceptable specification and tolerances. And then finally, mixing times, whether that be our batch mixers in the mills or in instances where we're mixing feed on the truck, are mixing times adequate to distribute the feed additives through the feed properly. Corrective and preventative actions that would occur in case we have a problem with a feed medication. First of all, if it's something that might have come from a supplement supplier, we need to inform that supplier that we had a problem with one of the feed medications. This may be a potency or concentration issue as an example. If we have an example of a problem, whether it's a misapplication or improper dosing that might have occurred, we would need to possibly extend the withdrawal time of the cattle. In other words, lengthen that period of time after they had the feed additive removed from their feed before they moved into the slaughter process. We may need to check and adjust our micro machines and other apparatus that we use to add these feed additives into our feed rations. And finally, we may need to adjust our mixing times, whether that's in the mill or out on the truck. Suggested records that we check and look at when we conduct audits would be lab assay reports. Are our rations being checked periodically for feed additives and concentrations to ensure that the proper potency is occurring in those rations? Maintenance logs. How often, how frequently are scales, weighing apparatus, other machines and apparatus that we use to add feed additives, how often are those maintained and checked? Inventory control records. This is usually a daily report out of the feed mill. How many pounds of XYZ feed additive should have been used that day, and how much do we have on inventory, or how much disappeared from that inventory that day. Calibration logs, mixing time logs, daily mill reports, anything that would show and be able to use to track back and ensure that our feed medications are being mixed and used properly in the feed yard. And then finally, verification. Once again, this would be managerial, or in this case, as it says, professional. This may be your consultant reviewing records from the feed mill, records from the feed delivery to ensure that everything is within tolerance. Again, calibration of equipment to verify that the equipment is working properly. And then finally, a key factor here is feed yard employee signatures on daily reports and delivery tickets. One of the things that is looked at when an audit is conducted is on feed delivery tickets where supplements, for instance, may be delivered to the feed yard. Are employees of the feed yard checking to make sure that the proper supplement has been delivered to the feed yard, and then signing the scale tickets to verify that someone checked and ensured the proper supplement was delivered? Also in the feed mill, on the daily inventory reports for feed additives, is someone signing that report to show that yes, we reviewed the report, we noted any problems or lack of problems, and sign that report, verify that someone is reviewing those records and reviewing those daily reports. Another critical control point dealing with feed resources would be supplement receiving. The supplements we receive from, whether that be our liquid-based supplements, our dry-based supplements that are providing, in many cases, may be providing vitamins, minerals, and other critical micronutrients that we need to add into the feed to ensure proper health and performance of our cattle. The primary hazard here would be the prevention of bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE. If you'll recall, it's been a number of years now. This was a great concern developed over in Europe and England, and our preventative measures in the United States were to tighten up our use of animal protein sources in our ruminant feeds. So basically now in the U.S. we cannot use animal protein sources from ruminants in ruminant feeds. This would include meat and bone meal, blood meal products. We cannot use those in ruminant feeds. So one of our steps to prevent that is at the feed yard we need to ensure that the supplements that are being delivered to the feed yard are the supplements that were ordered for the feed yard, and that the ingredients in those supplements do not include any animal protein sources. Our criteria for this are zero tolerance. This is a regulated item by the federal government, and we have zero tolerance for use of animal protein sources in ruminant feeds. Monitoring procedures used at the feedlot would be to obtain certification statements from supplement suppliers. Basically, typically that's a letter submitted annually to the feed yard by the supplement suppliers that would indicate that they do not use animal protein sources in the production of their beef feeds, or it may say we absolutely use no animal protein products, period, in our feed mill. But once again, this is a quality control assurance from the supplement supplier. We should also only receive supplements from suppliers that give us those certification statements. If you have a supplement supplier that refuses to provide that information, then it may be that you need to conduct your business elsewhere. You need to obtain certification statements from trucking companies. The idea here is that a supplement could be contaminated if it is loaded onto a truck that had previously hauled meat scraps or some other meat products prior to hauling that supplement to the feed yard. So certification statements from those trucking companies are also another monitoring procedure. We need to check each delivery to ensure that the delivery was to the correct feed yard and that the supplement delivered to the feed yard was the correct supplement. It's rare, but it does occur that occasionally a truck pulls into the wrong feedlot or feed yard or the wrong animal livestock operation and potentially could unload the wrong supplement at that location. That could be an error on the part of the truck driver, but also you need to check that invoice that comes with that feed to ensure that it's the right feed. Even though it may have come to your feed yard, to the right feed yard, was the right feed loaded on the truck before it brought the delivery in. So that's another monitoring point. And finally, maintain copies of all invoices and supplement ingredient composition, once again, to be able to check those to ensure that protocols are being followed properly. Corrective or preventative actions. What happens if something occurs? Well, number one, we need to refuse loads from suppliers without certification statements. If there's a corrective or preventative action, again, this is something that you want to make sure that this never occurs, because there are dire consequences that if animal protein sources are used in our supplements for beef cattle, the corrective action is going to create an economic hardship for the feed yard. So we want this to never occur. Suggested records that we need. Supplier certification statements, we mentioned those earlier. Keep those on hand. Supplement ingredient composition. Be that printout from the supplement manufacturer showing what ingredients are included in that supplement. And then finally, the delivery tickets for the supplement. When the supplement is delivered to the feed yard, the delivery ticket that is signed by the feed yard employee showing that they checked these documents to ensure that it was the right feed delivered to the right feed yard. Verification, annual managerial review of certification statements. Go back and have those certification statements renewed each year. Managerial approval of the supplement suppliers on an annual basis. And finally, feed yard employee signatures on these delivery tickets to ensure that the right feed is being delivered to the right feed yard. So now we've covered the critical control points for feed sources in the feed yard. Now let's review some of the quality control points in the feed yard for feed sources. 6 of these would be grain receiving, silage receiving, roughage receiving, feed fats, feed supplements and non-traditional feeds that might be used in the feed yard, and water for the cattle. On grain receiving, from a quality control point, and once again on the quality control points, these are issues that we check with the feed yard manager. These are not necessarily something that might lend to the feed yard failing an audit. These are not required points. These are suggested points. But on quality control points on grain receiving, we're typically concerned about the physical condition of the grain that arrives at the feed yard. Things such as moisture level, test weight of the grain, broken kernels, foreign materials, color of the grain, odor of the grain, mold that might be in the grain. These are a concern from a quality standpoint. Remember, quality deals with efficient management of the feed yard, efficient production of cattle. Well, the reason these would be issues is that all of these may affect the ability to thoroughly process the grain and extract as much energy and efficient production from the cattle, and they may affect and therefore affect feed nutritional value of the rations that we produce. Criteria or critical limits. In this area of the country, many times the grains are priced on the Southwest scale of discounts, which includes grading the grain based on USDA grain grades from 1 through 5 and sample grades, which all indicate potentially different problems with the grain and nutritional value of that processed grain, and then scaling the price or discounting the price according to that grain grade. And there may be other similar measures of quality, but that would be basically our criteria, setting specifications for what the grade of the grain would be, and then either accepting that grain or discounting the grain if it's out of those specifications. Monitoring procedures, sample and analyze loads of grain to make sure that they fit the specifications ordered by the feedlot. And this could also be supplier information, grain grades provided by the elevator to the feedlot or some other supplier information. Corrective or preventative actions. If a load of grain that comes in that's out of specs, then you could potentially reject that grain or hold the grain. Holding the grain until the supplier can be contacted. Many times the corrective preventative action may simply involve a discount, but in all cases you need to inform the supplier that the grain that was delivered was out of specifications. Suggested records, once again, grain grading reports. What were the grades of the grain that were delivered? Verification, once again, would be simply review by management staff, whether that be the feed mill manager, the procurement people, or the manager of the feedlot itself, making sure the grain's in specifications. Silage receiving. Once again, we're concerned about the physical condition of the silage that's being delivered to the feed yard, or excuse me, the plant material that will be inside to make silage that's delivered to the feed yard. Moisture, foreign material that might occur in those plant materials, the odor of the plant material, the length of the cut, the appearance, the maturity of the crop that was harvested. All of these can create issues dealing from how much that material will shrink during the ensiling process, how well it will ensile or preserve itself, and therefore may affect the feed nutritional value of the rations that we build using these silage products. Criteria critical limits, we've noted here on the slide industry standards. There are some standards that are used in terms of moisture and other concerns, but many times these are agreements made between the growers and the feed yard in terms of what those criteria specification would be for the silage product. Monitoring procedures, sample and inspect the loads of material as they're delivered to the pit at the feed yard. Corrective or preventative action is hold the silage and inform the supplier that there's a problem with the silage. Suggested records, managerial observation and analysis, once again, as that during silage harvest, monitoring the loads that are being brought in and making sure everything's up to specifications. Once again, same verification, managerial review during that silage harvest season to ensure things are being, specifications are being met. Roughage receiving. This would include cottonseed hulls, ground hay, any other roughage type products that are brought onto the feed yard. As we noted with the grain and the silage, we have similar issues that we're concerned about, and that's the physical condition of that feed stuff when it's delivered to the feed yard. Everything from the moisture content to the odor of the product, presence of foreign material, appearance, all of these issues once again can affect shrink and can also affect feed nutritional value as we build feed products with these roughages. Criteria critical limits, once again, whatever standards the industry may have or the standards that may be set by the consultant or the feed yard itself. There are for alfalfa, there are standards such as the Southwest scale of discounts that's used in the grain. There is a Southwest alfalfa trading standards that might be used in the case of alfalfa hay to set criteria for your roughage products. Monitoring procedures. Once again, sample and inspect the loads as they're brought into the feed yard to ensure that they're meeting specifications set by the yard. Corrective or preventative actions, hold the roughage or inform the supplier of a problem. Suggested records, once again, managerial observations, analysis of those products. And finally, verification is the managerial review to ensure that those products are meeting the specifications and quality requirements for the feed yard. Feed fat would be quality control point number 4. We add fat into our rations because it's an energy-dense source of feed that's usually priced competitively from an energy standpoint, so it allows, at least in the High Plains area, Texas and other places, it provides us an energy source that's relatively inexpensive to enhance the energy value of our rations and enhance the efficiency of production of our cattle. Once again, concerns here would be physical condition, the odor, the color of the fat, other lab analysis, laboratory analysis type issues that might be measured would be the moisture content of the fat, peroxides, which indicate some degradation of the fat, what's the pH or acidity of the fat, the amount of free fatty acids, other impurities that might be in that feed fat. Once again, that can affect feed nutritional value, and some of these may also affect animal health. Criteria critical limits, once again, is our feed fat, the fat being delivered to the feed yard, meeting the contract specifications set by the feed yard. Monitoring procedures, observe the loads as they come in. Also, from a monitoring procedure would be to use reputable suppliers of those feed fat products. Corrective or preventative actions, as we mentioned earlier with other feedstuffs, accept, reject the loads, apply discounts based on the quality, and inform the supplier anytime you feel there's a problem has occurred. Suggested records would be some laboratory analysis. Pull samples of the loads of fat, have those analyzed to make sure that the fat is meeting your specifications for the feed yard. And finally, verification of, once again, would be managerial or in some cases professional review by the consultant of records of those fat deliveries and fat analyses. Quality control point number 5 in the feed sources area would be feed supplements and non-traditional feed sources. Once again, feed supplements would be supplements such as liquids. In some cases, that may be some of our distillers' products that are coming in. Non-traditional feed sources would be things such as corn gluten feed pellets, distillers' grains, other things that might fall outside the realm of hay, cottonseed hull, silage, and grain that goes into those rations. Concerns here would be the physical condition of those feedstuffs as they arrive at the feed yard. Is there any indication of spoilage of that feed? With some of these high moisture feeds, spoilage can be an issue. Odor, color, temperature of the feed when it arrives, fines, foreign materials, pellet size, if pellet size is something that's important. Once again, these issues deal with the nutritional value of that feed product, therefore the nutritional value of the feed that we manufacture using these products, but they can also affect handling of these products as they move through the mill and through our ration manufacturing process that may create some efficiency issues inside the mill. Criteria critical limits, again, simply to set some contract specifications and make sure those feedstuffs meet those specifications. Monitoring is observation of those loads as they come into the yard. Corrective and preventative actions, once again, accept, reject, or discount the feedstuffs based on the quality. Inform the suppliers if there's a problem occurring. Suggested records may be laboratory results or other records that might be used to document whether a problem occurs or not. And then finally, verification would be managerial or professional review of the records to ensure everything is staying within specifications. And then finally, the sixth critical or quality control point under feed sources is water. And on water, we would be specifically concerned with elements and total dissolved solids levels in the water, drinking water for the cattle. Issues here would be water intake and also feed intake. Water intake by cattle and feed intake by cattle are intimately related. If cattle can't drink enough water, their feed intake will be depressed. If there's problems such as excess total dissolved solid levels or other elements in the water that may suppress water intake by the cattle, then we may have suppressed feed intake and suppressed performance and efficiency of those animals. Criteria critical limits would be our industry standards for livestock water. We have recommendations that are published for different elements in water, hardness, salinity of the water, total dissolved solids of the water. We have published recommendations for those that can be reviewed and followed. Monitoring procedures, analyze the water annually, at least once annually, to ensure or at least have an idea of where what the content of the drinking water is being provided to the cattle. Corrective or preventative actions. We put on here treat water as necessary, but in reality that's probably uneconomical. We are fortunate, at least in the High Plains area, to have relatively good water for our cattle where we don't have to deal with that. As we move up into Colorado and some other areas, there are some issues with sulfates in the water. And many times we just have to develop a management system that works around that problem rather than trying to use some external treatment of the water to improve quality of the water. Again, suggested records might be laboratory results of your annual water analyses, and then verification, again, simply managerial review of your records. So to close on the feed sources, a bit of a review. On the feed sources, we had 3 critical control points. Once again, these critical control points address issues that are associated with government regulations. We had a critical control point dealing with grain receiving, primarily focusing on aflatoxin levels in grain. We had a critical control point dealing with feed medications, which is proper dosing, proper potency, proper delivery of those feed additives to the cattle. And finally, the final critical control point was on supplement receiving, and again, dealing with the issues to prevent the introduction of animal protein products into our feed yards, which is prohibited by the Food and Drug Administration. Then we had 6 quality control points dealing from grain receiving down to drinking water for the livestock. going to continue now and cover the critical control points and quality control points for the cattle section of the Texas Cattle Feeders Association Beef Safety and Quality Assurance Program. If you remember a schematic that we had on feed sources used in the feed yard, which basically went from receiving that feed until the feed was delivered to the cattle, you can see on this schematic for the cattle we have the same approach, beginning with cattle coming into the feed yard and continuing over until cattle are shipped from the feed yard. As we had with the feed sources, we have a number of critical control points as well as quality control points dealing with cattle. Notice as we begin with incoming cattle, we have a quality control point on incoming cattle, quality control point dealing with animal identification, quality control points dealing with the use of growth implants. Then when we move to injections, which would deal with our animal health products, we have a critical control point as well as quality control. A number of other quality control points as we move through the schematic. Then another critical control point dealing with processing and treatment of animals. Once again, this will deal with the proper use of animal health products. And then finally, shipping of those cattle. Let's look at these individually. Begin with the critical control points for the cattle. We have one dealing with injections, one dealing with processing and treatment. When we move to injections, our hazard that we're concerned with here would be broken needles. These would be broken needles that remain embedded in the animal after they break off. This is a critical issue because broken needles in beef, although they're a rare problem, they are an important hazard. And we do have reports about once a year. I'll hear a report of where some animal or some food product that had a broken needle in it. We need to protect against that in our cattle operations. Criteria and critical limits. As you can imagine, zero tolerance. We do not tolerate broken needles that remain in animals. Our monitoring procedure, we have procedures both at the chute and then also documentation procedures. Our procedures at the chute or in our processing facilities is that the processors that are using the syringes, using the needles to inject animal health products, visually check the needles after each injection to ensure that the needle is not bent and also to ensure that the needle is still present on the end of the syringe. Corrective and preventative actions. What if a needle breaks off and remains in an animal? Well, a preventative action to prevent this from occurring, once again, is to change needles frequently and when that needle is damaged or bent. A common recommendation would be every 10 to 25 head of animals, change the needle. This, again, puts a fresh needle on onto the syringe. It reduces, or it maintains a sharp needle that goes in the animal more easily and also prevents any damage or trauma to the tissue around where the injection was administered. But also, then ensures that we have a needle that has integrity and will not break off. A second part of the preventative action is proper restraint of the animal. Many times when a needle may break off is because the animal is not properly restrained, they're moving around, and therefore the needle breaks off. So proper restraint, proper operation of the chute, and changing the needles are two primary preventative actions for broken needles. Corrective action would be what if that needle does break off. First would be the crew would try to remove that needle from the animal. This may be as simple as locating where the injection was administered and using a surgical scalpel or an extremely sharp knife to make a small incision in the skin, then reach in with a pair of forceps and pull that needle from the animal. If that's not possible, notify the veterinarian and see if they can surgically remove the needle from the animal. Whatever the occurrence, that animal needs to be identified. The individual ear tag or some individual unique identification for that animal, that this animal has a broken needle in the animal. That incident needs to be recorded, and the management must be notified that that needle broke off in the animal, and then what was the status? Was the needle successfully removed, or was the crew unable to remove the needle? Suggested records would be the processing orders that are signed by the crew, and also the daily hospital report signed by the crew. These are two records that when an audit is conducted on the feed yard, the auditors will look for these records. They will look at the processing cards or the processing orders for a group of cattle. and check to see that the processing card indicates that there were no broken needles, and that is signed by the leader of the processing crew. They will also check the daily hospital reports to see that there were no needles reported, and also that that is signed by the head of the hospital crew. Verification procedures then once again would be managerial review of those processing cards and the daily hospital reports to ensure that there were no broken needles, and also that those reports are being signed for documentation purposes. Our second critical control point on cattle would be processing and treatment of the animal. And once again, as we talked about with feed medications, we are now talking about residues that might occur from the use of pharmaceutical products to either prevent health disorders or help treat animals that are suffering from a health disorder. The issues here would be chemical residues that might occur from vaccines, antibiotics, parasiticides, and these residues might occur as a result of improper dosing or insufficient withdrawal time before those animals move to slaughter. Our criteria and critical limits: zero tolerance. Once again, we have zero tolerance for animals leaving the feed yard that may potentially be carrying a residue in their tissues that could be introduced into the food chain. We need to follow label or veterinary recommendations for dosage or withdrawal times. The veterinarian is the professional animal health consultant for the operation. They develop the protocols, they develop the recommendations for the products being used, and assign the proper dosages and withdrawal times for those protocols, and we need to follow those. Extra label drug use can only occur on the direction of the consulting veterinarian. Let's briefly review what extra label drug use is. Extra label drug use is the administration of the drug in a manner that is not stated on the drug's labeling. Each animal health product has a label that has been approved by the Food and Drug Administration that specifies the routes of administration, the dosages, and the withdrawal times in animals that have been had those drugs administered to them for health purposes. So anything that we do that is not listed on that label is considered extra label use. So once again, this would include the use in a species not listed on the label. For instance, using a swine medicine to medicate cattle, that would be extra label use. Use for diseases or symptoms not listed on the label. So we have an animal that's suffering from a health problem, we use a certain antibiotic, but it's not, the indications do not indicate on the label that that would be proper use of that antibiotic. That would be extra label use. Use at a dosage level higher than stated on the label would be also extra label use, or using in a route of administration not listed on the label. So for instance, an animal health product that may be labeled for intravenous or IV use only, if we apply that subcutaneously or intramuscularly, that is extra label drug use. Extra label drug use can only occur under a veterinarian's direction and supervision. So it may be possible to use these extra label applications of animal health products, but this must occur under the direction and supervision of the consulting veterinarian for the feed yard. Also, any extra label drug use requires an extended withdrawal period, and that must be designated by the consulting veterinarian. So once again, under our criteria and critical limits, if we're going to use drugs or animal health products that are not labeled for beef cattle, that must be under the direction of the veterinarian. If we're going to use those at a dosage rate above that on the label, it must be under the direction of our consulting veterinarian. Or if we're going to use a different different route of administration for that animal health product, it must be under the direction of the consulting veterinarian. Monitoring procedures for the processing and treatment to avoid residues of products in animals would be managerial observation of the use of these products. The cattle manager, the crew leader, whatever member of the feed yard personnel staff that is responsible for supervising the use of those products makes certain that the protocols are being followed properly. Maintain records of treatment dates and withdrawal times for animals. Potentially a test such as what's called the LAST test, which is a test that can be used to test the urine for any residues that might still be in the animal, might be something to be used especially in a situation where you've had animals that have been ill or had extra label drug use. Some spot tests such as the LAST test might be useful. A critical point, though, once again, one of the things that the auditors will check each time they are conducting an audit at the feed yard is they will check the, quote, safe to ship reports on lots of cattle. That's a report that's run before the cattle are shipped to show any animals that may not have cleared withdrawal times for animal health products. That report is checked, and we check to ensure that the cattle manager, the assistant manager, or whatever staff member is responsible for checking that has signed off on the report to indicate they've checked all those animals and removed any animals from the lot that have not cleared withdrawal times. Corrective or preventative actions for residues of pharmaceutical products. Again, our preventative actions. How do we prevent this from occurring? Good employee training. What's the proper use of the animal health products? How do we check our withdrawal reports? How do we test animals in case we need to make sure they're not carrying residues? Good employee training. Written directions on the use of products. Have our consulting veterinarian provide written protocols on how to treat animals, what antibiotics or animal health products to utilize, and how to use those. Using the proper dosage. Most of our feed yards today have scales underneath the chute, so we know what individual animals weigh, and we can adjust the dosage based on their weights. Establish withdrawal times and dates. Once again, record the date that that animal was treated so that a withdrawal time can be established and checked before that animal leaves the feedlot. And then, as we talked about on the safe to ship report, clear each animal before they ship to ensure that they're clear of any potential residues. Corrective action, what occurs if an animal leaves the feed yard and we find out that they had potentially were carrying a residue or had not cleared withdrawals. We need to identify who that animal is and immediately notify the purchaser that an animal that left the feed yard may not have cleared withdrawals. Suggested records. Again, our processing orders. Who, what, when, and where occurred during processing of those cattle. Treatment records. Once again, who, what, when, and where was treated for a health disorder, what was utilized, what was the dosage rate, what's the withdrawal time associated with that animal health product for records. And then those shipment records, the safe to ship reports that have been checked and signed by the appropriate feed yard management personnel. Then finally, verification is again managerial review of the records, approval of the withdrawals and shipments, making sure all those documents are checked and signed. So those are the two critical control points within cattle, the cattle segment of the Texas Beef Safety and Quality Assurance Program. Now let's quickly go through the quality control points for the cattle segment. Once again, we have 7 quality control points dealing with quality issues in the cattle. And remember, quality control points deal with efficient, effective management and production of cattle in our feed yards. First would be incoming cattle. Visual assessment once the cattle arrive. Are they high risk, low risk, shrink, issues such as this that may indicate potential problems with the cattle. And arrival time and transit time. When did they arrive? How long were they in transit? All may be issues we want to monitor to get a better idea of how we may need to manage those cattle once they arrive. Corrective preventative actions may include accepting the load of cattle, rejecting a portion or all of the cattle on a load, or applying a discount because of quality issues. And then informing your supplier and or your customer of potential problems that might occur with a load of cattle. Suggested records, pre-arrival expectations. This may be what kind of cattle did we order, what weight, what condition, and did they meet those specifications once they arrived. And then also keeping a receiving report on the cattle. And then finally, verification would be review by the management to make certain that the cattle are meeting those quality aspects. Second two more quality control points for cattle quality would be dealing with identification of the cattle, both tagging or branding of the cattle. Things we might be concerned with would be infections that might occur because of tagging or branding procedures, interference with or destruction of implants. The ears of the cattle are used for both identification with ear tags, but that's also where we place our growth implants for the animals, so there may be some interference with those. And then issues from a quality standpoint would be location and size of brands that have been applied to the cattle or that the feed yard may apply to the cattle. And these issues all deal with potential health problems to the animals, potential performance loss, or hide devaluation because of the branding procedures. Criteria critical limits. What are the processing standards established by the feed yard? That would be our criteria that we would deal with. Monitoring procedures would be managerial observation of the processing crew to make sure that things are being applied correctly. Corrective or preventative actions. How do we prevent a problem from occurring? Things such as, once again, employee training. What are the proper procedures? Disinfecting tag applicators to reduce the chance of infections in the ear from the application of the ear tags. Proper placement of the tags or brands on the cattle. Corrective actions, if we have problems occurring, is simply to modify procedures and possibly go through employee training one more time. Suggested records, we don't have any of those recommended necessarily. That would be up to the management of the feed yard. Also, verification procedures would be up to the management of the feed yard. Implants and reimplants. Again, we use implants, growth implants in cattle to improve efficiency of production from those animals. Again, these are safe. We're not creating tissue residue problems. We use these to enhance growth and performance of those animals with the feed sources that we have. Issues that we would be concerned about would be potential performance loss, possibly the increased incidence of buller type cattle from the use of implants, or devaluation of carcasses that might result from implants that were abscessed, implants that were crushed during the administration procedure, improper placement of that implant, or the wrong interval of use of implants in the cattle. Criteria critical limits that might be considered would be whatever the standards that are developed by the feed yard or the supplier of those implants. Also, the implanting and reimplanting schedules that may be established by the consulting nutritionist. Proper disinfection of applicators to avoid abscesses in the ears around the implants, and then also proper placement procedures for those implants. Monitoring procedures, once again, simply managerial observation of the cattle processing crew to make sure things are being conducted correctly. This might also include observation by the consultant or a company representative that's supplying the implants to the feed yard, and also training and certification programs that might be available for the processing crews. Corrective or preventative action. In the case that we have problems with our implants, preventative, once again, to prevent problems would be proper employee training and proper administration procedures, developing appropriate implant and reimplant schedules to be used with different groups of cattle, proper placement of the implant in the ear, and then disinfection procedures for the applicators. Corrective actions in the case that we are, or that an unusual incidents of abscesses or other problems of occurring, corrective actions would be, again, to modify the procedures being used by the crew, or possibly change processors if the modification of procedures doesn't correct the problem. Suggested records may be ear palpation, where someone goes in and checks the ears on the cattle to make sure the implants are being retained and that there's no implants and other issues with the implants. Processing records, and then again established implant and reimplant schedules and protocols for the cattle. And then finally, verification, once again, is managerial review of records and other procedures to ensure that the implants are being placed properly and are having the opportunity to work properly. Injections is another quality control point. We talked about potential tissue residues that would occur from the use of animal health products. We have another issue from a quality side which deals with injection sites. These would be injection site lesions and also product efficacy. Does the product work well? Our issues here would be animal health, potential carcass value problems, and then performance of the animals because of the product efficacy issues. Criteria critical limits would be that we use the proper injection site locations in the animal. As a rule of thumb, all injections in animals are recommended to be placed in front of the shoulder. As we can see on the small diagram in the top right-hand portion of this, the green trapezoidal area up on the neck of the animal, which occurs on both sides of the neck, so you have two sides, would be the proper location for all injections to occur. Not in the shoulder, not in the rump, or in those portions of the animal. Those are where the high-value cuts come from the animal. Up in the neck, that is typically used for ground beef products or some other product, and so the lesions, which the lesions do not create a potential health issue for the consumer, They're just an unsightly blemish that occurs in the meat, and so since those products up in the neck are typically used for ground beef products, those unsightly blemishes are not apparent. Monitoring procedures, criteria and critical limits, again, injection site location, proper handling and mixing of animal health products to ensure that the injection of that animal health product does not create a blemish, using the proper dosage and following the labeling requirements for route of administration and dosage requirements for those animal health products. Monitoring procedures, once again, managerial observation of the processing crew, the hospital crew, treatment of the animals to ensure that the injections are being placed properly and protocols are being followed. Also checking expiration date on products to make sure all products have not expired. That deals more with product efficacy and will the products work properly. Corrective preventative actions, once again, good employee training. How do we do it? When do we do it? Why do we do it? To ensure that we don't create blemishes and that our products work properly. Proper injection placement, following the dosage guidelines, changing needles. We talked about changing needles earlier to avoid broken needles. Changing needles can also reduce the incidence of injection site blemishes because we keep a sharp needle that has less tissue damage or less trauma to the tissue when that injection is placed in the animal. Using sanitary techniques as best we can to avoid infecting that injection site. And then finally, modifying procedures. If we have a problem, let's go back and modify our procedures so that we may be able to correct that problem. Suggested records would keep the processing records and maps for the groups of cattle. These are basically directions on how to apply the products and also a record of what products were applied and how they were applied. And then finally, verification would be up to the feed yard, whether that's reviewed by the cattle manager or some member of the management team to ensure that protocols are being followed properly. Let's talk just a bit more about injection site lesions, why they're important. Again, injection site lesions, which you can see from the picture in the upper right-hand corner, would be an example of injection site lesions. These result in product loss for the retailer and the consumer because, as you can imagine, if a consumer walked into a store and saw a blemish such as that in that round steak in the upper right-hand corner, they're not going to necessarily want to buy that product. As I said earlier, these injection site blemishes do not represent a food safety problem. These are safe products, but you can see that if a consumer saw that in the store, they would think there's something wrong with that piece of meat. So in order to sell that product, the retailer or someone prior to the retailer has to trim that injection site lesion out, or that round steak that you see in the upper right-hand corner may have to end up in a ground beef product, which has a lower value than a round steak would. So these injection site lesions represent a product loss as well as an economic loss for the industry when they occur. Also, injection site lesions, even if we could go in and trim that injection site lesion out of that piece of round steak, that injection site lesion creates tougher beef tissue around that injection site lesion as much as 3 inches away. So if you think about something about the size of a grapefruit, 3 inches in diameter around that scar, that meat has become tougher because that scar was present. So we create a beef product that is less acceptable from an eating quality standpoint. And then finally, ultimately, is consumer dissatisfaction. They don't want the tougher beef. They do not want that unsightly blemish in the beef products that they're buying. What causes the injection site lesions or blemishes? Irritation from the chemicals in pharmaceuticals. Many of the injection site lesions are the result of some of the vaccines that we use, and the way vaccines work is they must create irritation inside the tissue of the animal to attract the immune system to that location, so the immune system can then develop antibodies that protect the animal from any future exposure to that disease. Well, those chemicals that are necessary to create that immune response also irritate the tissue and can create that injection site blemish. So once again, we do not want to put those into the high quality or high value cuts of meat on the animal. We put those in the location on the animal where the vaccine will work, but it will also be in an area where the value of that meat cut is not going to be discounted greatly.
We can also create an injection site blemish by the amount of product that we inject into one site. If you look at many of our animal health products, they have on the label, they will have dosage guidelines, do not exceed X milliliters or cc's injected at any given site. That's not only affects the efficacy of that animal health product, but it also increases the chances of an injection site blemish because we injected more of that product into one site than should have been injected at that site. Damaged or dull needles can create more trauma and create an injection site blemish. And then contamination of the injection site with mud, dust, manure, things we all deal with in the feed yards can create that. We can't get away from it, but we need to do the best we can to avoid that kind of contamination. Again, prevent and minimize injection site blemishes by number one, administering all injections in front of the shoulder, in the green trapezoid on the diagram. Use label routes of administration. If possible, use the subcutaneous route of administration for products because that injection site then is between the muscle and the skin and does not create a blemish that remains in the muscle. Follow the label guidelines for the amount injected in each injection site. Use as sanitary technique as possible when we're processing or treating animals, and then change damaged or dull needles to reduce the amount of tissue trauma that occurs with that injection. Another area of quality control point would be banding and tipping of animals. This would deal with intact males that arrive at the feed yard or animals that have horns when they arrive. Again, issues here would be potential animal health problems. In the case of intact males, ultimate effects on carcass value from those animals, and then finally performance issues that might have occurred because of animal health issues. We're concerned about infections that might occur, partial castration of the animal from banding. In other words, the testicles are not completely removed and we end up with an animal that's staggy, which can affect carcass value, heavy bleeding that might occur, or excessive swelling that might occur from these procedures. Again, our criteria critical limit is work with the consulting veterinarian for the feed yard to develop the protocols and the proper procedures when banding and tipping animals. Monitoring procedures, once again, employees observing the animals that were either banded or had their horns tipped, and also managerial observation of the procedures that are used as these animals are processed. Corrective and preventative actions, good employee training, disinfection of instruments that are used in these procedures, and if we still have problems, modify our procedures that are used in the handling of those animals to reduce the probability that we have an issue that results from banding of intact males or tipping horns on other animals. Suggested records, simply keep our treatment records to see if we have a higher incidence of problems with these animals. And then finally, verification would be managerial review of the records. Another quality control point in the cattle section is cattle handling. Texas Cattle Feeders Association has updated the Texas Cattle Feeders Beef Safety and Quality Assurance Program to include an entire section on proper cattle handling and management techniques. We will address that in another section of these presentations, but we'll review some of the issues today that were initially cited in the Beef Safety and Quality Assurance Program. One of the major issues cited in this quality part would be carcass value. Specifically, bruising that may occur because of handling issues with the cattle, or another would be dark cutting cattle that occur because of potential handling problems at the feed yard. Bruising, when a carcass at a processing plant has bruises, those bruises are trimmed out of the carcass. So that represents a product loss. If you're selling cattle on a grid, on a carcass base, then that's a weight loss for the cattle feeder that sold the cattle. If the cattle have been sold on a live basis and those bruises are trimmed out, that's a weight and product loss for the processor. Bruising is something we want to avoid. This can deal with cattle handling. Dark cutters are animals that have been stressed in some fashion prior to, within 24 to 48 hours of shipment to the processing plant. Essentially, the sugar in their muscle called glycogen has been depleted. In their muscle, there's nothing wrong with the eating quality of the muscle necessarily or the beef quality. It's just that it's a dark maroon color rather than a bright cherry red, as you would expect that lean tissue to be. So it can also represent loss in carcass value because those carcasses are discounted because they are dart cutters. We need to manage cattle so we avoid bruising and the potential for dart cutters. Then our criteria and critical limits are that we have proper handling of those animals when we move them, when we're handling those animals, in good facility design for low stress handling of the cattle, low stress movement of the cattle, and fewer opportunities for the animals to have a bruise from hanging on a corner or running into a gate or some other issue that might create a bruise in those animals. Monitoring procedures, managerial observation of the employees and how they handle cattle. And then also packing plant reports. What's the incidence of bruising or carcass trim? What's the incidence of dart cutters as cattle have moved into the processing plants? Corrective and preventative actions, once again, good employee training on proper handling procedures, notifications of truckers and shippers that may also be responsible for some of these issues, and then modifying our handling procedures and our facilities at the feed yard to reduce the incidence of these problems. There are no suggested records, no suggested verification procedures. Leave that up to the feed yard for their own discretion. As I mentioned, there's another section of this program that deals completely with the cattle handling side of it. We call that the animal or cattle handling and care audit. We'll discuss that in a separate section of the program. In that, we look at the condition of the feeding pens, the condition of the hospital and processing facilities, the condition of the shipping and receiving facilities, and then we also observe cattle handling and cattle behavior through the processing facilities, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a later section. So to wrap up on the cattle segment of the Beef Safety and Quality Assurance program, we had two critical control points. One of those dealt with injections, the other dealt with processing and treatment of the animals. Once again, these deal with broken needles and residues that would occur in the animals that would create a food safety problem. So these both address food safety issues. Then we had 7 quality control points focusing on cattle that would address health, performance, and effective management issues of those cattle while they're in the feed yard. The final section that we'll discuss will deal with pharmaceuticals and biologicals that we use in the feed yard. In this, there are no critical control points. These are all quality control points that deal with these pharmaceutical and biological products. If we look under pharmaceuticals and biologicals on the schematic, once again, you can see we have a quality control point under purchasing, a quality control point under receiving and storage of those pharmaceutical and biological products, and finally a quality control point under handling of those products. Each one of these deals with the efficacy of those products, how well they will use, how successful we will be using those products in the animals to promote better animal health. Under purchasing, the things we need to be concerned about would be adulterated products and product efficacy. Once again, we want those products to be efficacious so that we promote better animal health and we promote better efficient performance of the animals. Criteria and critical limits here. Again, we want to use reputable suppliers of our animal health products, and we want product specifications for each one of the products that we purchase and utilize so we can have those specs outlined and know what we're purchasing. Monitoring procedures. The feed yard should have a list of reputable pharmaceutical suppliers. Corrective or preventative action is order pharmaceuticals and biologicals only from those approved suppliers for the feed yard. Suggested records would be to keep our invoices of what we purchase, keep good track of inventory, and have a good vet-client-patient relationship, which most feed yards do, and that involves having that veterinarian that knows the feed yard, knows the type of cattle that are being managed at the feed yard, and therefore can develop the protocols for animal health procedures and help develop that list of products to be used on the feed yard. Under receiving and storage, once again, we're dealing with product efficacy and how that affects animal health and performance. Our criteria and critical limits follow the label requirements for temperature for storage of those products. And also monitor product expiration dates so that we make sure those products are not expired that we're using, and that can affect efficacy. Monitoring procedures, again, proper storage. Our storage rooms, do they have proper temperature? Are the bottles the inventory being rotated appropriately so that expiration dates, or so the products are used prior to expiration dates? Rotation of open containers. Some of our products, we may partially use those. We need to make sure we go ahead and use those open containers up, or possibly dispose of those open containers even though they're partially utilized. And again, inspection of the storage room and inventory control would be monitoring procedures. Corrective preventative actions. Discard damaged or expired products. Suggested records that may be useful would be inventory records to make sure the inventory is being turned appropriately, and then a temperature log for the storage areas to ensure that the storage areas maintain at proper temperature to maintain product efficacy. Then under handling, under quality control, would be deal with damaged containers, contamination of containers, exposure of our pharmaceuticals and biologicals to heat or light, and partial containers that are not immediately used after they're opened. All of these can affect product efficacy and then affect our animal health responses. Criteria and critical limits to be considered here: limit the times products are handled. How many times can we use an open container before we dispose of it? How many times do those products change hands between the storage room and the processing barn, and factors that may affect their exposure to temperature and ultraviolet light? And then establish guidelines for chute-side storage and handling of these products while they're being used out in the processing barns or in the hospitals. Monitoring procedures. Observe chute-side handling of these products and their administration. Corrective and preventative actions. Again, discard damaged products and good employee training on proper handling, storage, management, and use of these products to ensure efficacy. Suggested records might be inventory records, once again, to turn that inventory, make sure products are not expiring, and disposal records to know what has been disposed of and when. And then again, verification would be managerial oversight and review of records. One thing to remember on vaccine, which is our first line defense against health problems and hopefully will help us avoid performance declines and the use of other biologicals or pharmaceuticals, is that for a vaccine to be most effective, it must be kept out of direct sunlight and ultraviolet light. It needs to be kept cool at all times, and it needs to be administered in as clean an injection site as possible. So those are three things to keep in mind as we handle these products. So that's the brief overview of quality control points dealing with pharmaceuticals and biologicals. Again, these affect health, performance, and effective management of cattle that we have in our feed yards. And that wraps up our section on food safety and the critical control points and quality control points for feed resources, cattle, and our pharmaceuticals and biologicals that we use in our feed yards.
Welcome. I'm Ted McCollum with the Texas AgriLife Extension Service. In this segment of the program, we're going to review the Texas Cattle Feeders Association Beef Safety and Quality Assurance Program. And the portion we'll be going through in this segment is the cattle care and handling portion of the program. In today's environment, livestock producers need to be concerned more than ever about our handling and management practices of the animals we use to produce food for consumers. Our production practices, our handling, our management are under more scrutiny today than they ever have been. If we go back and look at a consumer survey conducted in 2008 by the Center for Food Integrity, we'll notice that one of the items focused on by the consumers in this survey was that producers should be held responsible for the proper and humane treatment of livestock that we use to produce food, whether that is a dairy product or a meat product. So in order to maintain consumer confidence in the beef industry, one of our focuses should be that we handle and manage cattle properly throughout our production system, from the cow-calf operations through the feed yards. Dr. Tom Field with NCBA recently summarized other consumer survey information about animal handling and care practices and consumers' views of these. And 6 of the major concerns are listed on this slide. The first would be stunning and handling practices at the time of slaughter. This is something of concern for the processors in our industry, not the producers. But an issue underneath this would be our management and care of non-ambulatory animals, those animals that are suffering from some physical ailment that prevents them from standing and moving about. We need to concentrate on developing and following through with humane euthanasia procedures for these animals. Second on this would be space requirements and density. In recent history, this is more of a concern in the poultry and the pork industries. But we also need to remember in the feed yard industry, we do deal with stocking densities in pens and matching the right amount of bunk space and the right amount of floor space in our pens to cattle numbers to manage both performance and health of those animals. Third would be practices that are perceived to be painful by those of us that may not be in the livestock industry. These are practices such as dehorning, castration of intact males. Tail docking was listed. That's a practice that's in the dairy industry, not really a great concern in the beef industry. But again, these are practices that are thought to be painful, and so our management and appropriate use of those practices needs to be focused upon. Fourth would be animal handling and transportation. How do we handle animals and how do we transport animals? Fifth would be on-farm euthanasia, and that's partly back in reference to the non-ambulatory animals. If we have animals that are at the end of their life or suffering from some terminal illness, humanely euthanizing those animals so they don't suffer any more than they have to. And number 6 would be antibiotic usage, the use of growth implants and beta agonists, which are feed additives. These are all covered in another portion of the Texas Cattle Feeders Beef Safety and Quality Assurance Program. Viewing this list and the public scrutiny that we're under in the beef cattle industry, we must ensure and demonstrate that our handling and care practices promote the health and well-being of the cattle we manage through the use of safe, scientifically based practices, and also provide a low stress environment for those animals during our production systems. By doing this, we can build what's called a pyramid of trust by using the principles of good stockmanship and having a proactive program to advance the best management practices in our operations, and then verifying that we're following through with those production practices. We gain public acceptance and we improve the trust from our consumers that we are humane in managing the animals that we utilize to produce food. Once again, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association has had a beef quality assurance program for over 20 years. One of the focuses of this program is the proper handling and management of cattle. These practices, again, apply all the way from the cow-calf segment of the industry through the feed yard, and this is a voluntary program. The Texas Cattle Feeders Association program added cattle care and handling to their beef safety and quality assurance program a few years ago. And to reiterate, the Texas Cattle Feeders Association yards that participate in the program are audited annually to ensure that the protocols and requirements for the TCFA program are being met. This is a two-part audit, one being the beef safety and quality portion of the audit, which was reviewed in an earlier presentation or another presentation. The second part then would be cattle handling practices on the feed yard. This portion of the audit
was added in 2003, where the program was updated to include cattle handling guidelines. At that time, it was not mandatory for certification. It was a report card for the feed yard. How are your practices? What do your practices look like? In 2010, this portion of the audit has become a requirement that if the yard is going to participate in the TCFA BSQA program, they must participate and allow the Texas Cattle Feeders Association to conduct a cattle care and handling audit on the feed yard. So let's review what is included in the cattle care and handling audit portion of the TCFA program so that you can become acquainted with the practices that are being implemented, and also if you're an employee of a yard or moving into that that arena of employment, you become familiar with what the requirements would be working for a feed yard. Okay, we'll start with the arrival and treatment program segment of the audit. The TCFA guideline states that preventative health management programs for newly arrived cattle and treatment programs for cattle with health problems must be designed by a veterinarian. The veterinarian is the professional trained in animal health and well-being. He or she are the individuals that are most up to date with current knowledge, current information, a world of experience working with large populations of cattle, and they therefore have the best information, the best grounding for developing proper management and treatment programs for both preventing health problems as well as treating those health problems. So that's why this is a requirement of the program. Underneath arrival programs, this would include vaccination and medication protocols for incoming cattle, castration, dehorning, and other procedures that may occur upon arrival at the feed yard. Under treatment programs, this would include protocols for treating cattle suffering from injuries or other illnesses. Or the employee responsibilities at the feed yard would be to follow those protocols and then communicate any problems or failures in those protocols to the management and to the veterinarian so that adjustments can be made to improve those treatment and arrival programs. A second requirement would be the area dealing with non-ambulatory or downer cattle, those animals that have an ailment and cannot stand or walk and do not have a chance of recovery. One of the concerns is how are those cattle moved? If an animal is a downer animal or non-ambulatory in a pen, if the animal is going to be moved from that pen to a rehabilitation area, how is that animal moved? The second would be if that animal has low probability of recovering from whatever the ailment is, what are the euthanasia protocols that will be used at the feed yard? In terms of movement of the non-ambulatory cattle, some general guidelines. Cattle should not be dragged by a chain, a rope, or any other means to remove them from a pen. The cattle should not be lifted or suspended in the air by a chain, or rope, or any other means. And the cattle should not be scooped into buckets or loaders to move them. The recommended protocol or procedures would be that the cattle are rolled completely into a loader bucket, and then once they are moved to the location where they'll be rehabbed, that they would be rolled out of that bucket. Another procedure that is often used is to develop a sled, which is pulled behind a tractor, and the animals would be rolled onto that sled, and the sled would be pulled to the rehabilitation area, and the animals would be rolled off of that sled. So once again, no dragging, no lifting, no scooping. Roll the animals into a bucket or onto a sled, move them out, and then roll them out of the bucket or off the sled once they've reached the location to which they're being moved. As far as euthanasia is concerned, cattle should be humanely euthanized within 24 to 36 hours of the onset of an injury or a health problem from which the veterinarian or other management staff deems that there is a low probability of recovery. Do not allow the animal to lay and suffer. The procedures for euthanasia should be reviewed and approved by the veterinarian that consults with the feed yard. And these may include the appropriate use of firearms or chemical procedures in the euthanasia process. The next area of concern would be cattle comfort. And the TCFA guidelines say that cattle should have free access to feed, water, and to move freely around pens. We would hope that this is the ultimate goal of everyone. We need animals to have access to feed, water, and move freely around pens so that they can produce efficiently and grow well and produce a good product. Some of the items that may be of concern here would be, what is the stocking rate or stocking density in our pens? How much bunk space are we allowing per head of animal in the pen? Do we have waterers that are the proper size and function properly to provide the adequate amount of water to the cattle in the pen? And finally, our feed management protocols. How often are cattle being fed? Are the feed deliveries timely? How do we manage storm periods in terms of making sure cattle have feed during storms and other issues? Next section would be under cattle handling. And in this, the auditors or TCFA would evaluate the cattle and the procedures that are being utilized in the processing area. And during an audit, this is evaluated by observing the processing of 100 head of cattle as they move through the processing facility. These may be cattle that have just arrived to the feed yard, or they may be cattle that have been in residence in the feed yard for a period of time. The observations as these cattle are observed would be to look at the behavior and flow of the cattle as they move through the processing facility, but also to look at the actions of the people that are handling the cattle. Again, this is important because the handle and transport of cattle needs to occur in a fashion that we minimize the possibility of stress, injury, and bruising of those cattle. Let's walk through a portion of the audit to show you what would be evaluated. This tends to be the portion of the audit that causes more concern among folks because we are standing there watching the people do the work and writing down a score. But hopefully by walking through this and giving an idea of what the auditors would evaluate would ease some people's concerns, but also demonstrate to others what we're actually observing and why. One of the things we would look at or observe is how many cattle vocalize after being restrained but before any procedures are implemented. So for instance, a steer walks into the chute, they're restrained in the squeeze chute before any needles are used to administer an injection or before any ear tags are put in the animal's ears. Is the animal vocalizing, which might demonstrate that the animal's under stress. Either the pressure on the chute's too tight or there's something else causing the animal to feel some pain or be uncomfortable. In the audit, out of the 100 head of cattle that will be observed, you're allowed for 5 head to vocalize in the manner that I just described. If 6 head or 10 head vocalize, so you exceed that threshold, then the question becomes, what's the reason for that vocalization? Do we go check the pressure on the chute? Do we check for pieces of metal that may be protruding that's causing discomfort in the animal, or whatever may be causing that vocalization? In some cases, it may just be the nature of the cattle. The auditors realize that there are cattle that behave differently, and some cattle just vocalize more than others without any stimulation. The second item that would be scored is how many cattle fall exiting from the chute. And a fall would be where an animal would actually go down and potentially their brisket or their stomach or part of the animal actually touches the ground as they leave the chute because they tripped, stumbled, and fell. You're allowed 2 head out of 100 in the audit to fall on the way out of the chute. Once again, if that exceeds 2%, the question becomes, why did the cattle fall? Was there a problem with the footing in front of the chute? Was it due to some handling practice used previously and the cattle were overstimulated when they entered the chute and therefore were overstimulated leaving and caused them to fall? The third area would be how many cattle trip or stumble while exiting the chute. A trip or a stumble would be, as it says, they trip or they stumble, but they don't fall to the ground. You're allowed 10 head out of 100. Once again, if it exceeds 10 head, the question becomes, why did they trip or stumble? Fourth would be how many cattle jump or run exiting the chute. And this can be a fairly subjective call, and sometimes this may be the nature of the cattle causing them to jump and run, or it may be, again, overstimulation by the handlers or some other issue. But in this case, you're allowed 25 out of 100 head to jump and run as they leave the chute. Once again, if you exceed that threshold, the question becomes, why did we exceed the threshold? And finally, how many times was a hot shot or electrical prod used on cattle during the time that they were going through the processing barn? You're allowed 10 head out of 100. If you exceed the 10 head or 10%, why was that occurring? Was it because the employee simply was overusing the electrical prod, or was it due to shadows or lighting in the processing area that were causing cattle to balk and therefore not move and lead to the use of the electrical prods? Again, the question becomes why, and can we take actions to make the system, make the cattle flow better? Other items that might be noted is the use of other cattle driving items, whether it be a paddle, a stick, or whatever. Is it necessary? If there's overuse on those, why is that occurring? Also, excessive noise. If there's a lot of noise inside the processing barn, that may cause the cattle to balk or become overstimulated and then create problems listed up elsewhere. Again, why are these a concern? Stress on cattle influences both health and performance of the cattle. And our job in the feed yard should be to promote good health and good efficient performance in the cattle, and stress is a negative for those characteristics. Also, potential injury of the cattle. Broken legs, shoulders that are bruised that cause animals to be lame, other issues that affect performance, health, and stress, and just overall well-being of the animals. Behavior and flow. If we note problems with the way cattle are moving through the processing facility, what are potential reasons for those problems and things that might need to be evaluated or adjusted or modified? It could, as I mentioned earlier, it could just be the inherent behavior of the cattle. There are wild cattle. There are cattle that are more docile and in between. And the auditors will note those problems. It could be lighting or shadows in the processing facilities. Cattle's perception or visual perceptions are different than ours. A shadow through the middle of a snake or an alley may appear to be a hole to an animal and cause them to balk and not want to move past that. A light in the wrong place may be blinding the animals. Other issues such as this can lead to cattle balking, and that may show up as animals that had excessive prod use or some other thing, and it was due to poor lighting or poor shadows, or bad shadows potentially. Excessive noise, I've already talked about that, from equipment banging and making noise to people yelling to stereos playing loud music. Again, may change the way animals flow through a facility. Some of our facilities are not built the best in the world. We're not saying everyone needs to go out and spend the money to redesign their facilities, but they may need to learn how to work better with the facilities that they have available to them. Equipment designs or malfunctions. This might be such as a squeeze chute or something along these lines where cattle are vocalizing excessively, or we're noting a lot of cattle tripping as they exit the chute. There may be something with the design of the head gate or the chute that is causing the animal to have discomfort or trip or fall as they leave that chute. Positioning of the employees in the area. Many times people that work in these facilities may be the newest employees on the feed yards. They may not understand where to stand to avoid having cattle balk so that they'll move easily through a facility. So a lot of times some of this is employee education on where they need to stand or where they need to be to make cattle move more easily through our facilities. And again, that would fall in with the employee habits or training or lack of training. Habitual use of electric prods could be a problem. Or again, lack of training on how to properly use an electrical prod or how to properly move cattle through a facility. A lot of those problems could be solved with just some good employee training. Now we move outside and begin to look at facilities. And what will be evaluated would be the loading and unloading areas, the processing facilities, the hospital barns, and the hospital pens. What we're looking for here to see is are those facilities, the gates, the chutes, other things, are they properly functioning? And is there the absence of potential problems that may affect the health or injure cattle as they're in those facilities? We will look at the presence or absence and the condition of non-slip flooring in working areas. Are there rubber floor mats? Is there textured concrete, graded concrete, or whatever that gives the animals better footing as they move into and out of the facilities? What's the condition and state of repair of gates, fences, crowding alleys, snakes, and other things? Are the gates working properly? Is the metal welded properly? Are there areas where the animals might be cut or injured? And then also the buildup of the manure and dirt in those areas. This is more of an indication of what kind of attention is paid to those facilities, but also if we're concerned about footing, an excessive buildup of manure and dirt in these areas can render our non-slip flooring or concrete that we've put in to help with footing can render that less effective. And these will be rated as excellent, acceptable, or unacceptable as we look at these characteristics of those facilities. What's excellent? Excellent could be deep grooved or well-maintained non-slip footing. All gates, fences, and chutes are in good working order and repair, and there's no significant buildup of dirt or manure in the areas. Acceptable would be that grooved footing or non-slip footing is present, but it may be becoming worn or smooth. Gates, fences, and chutes may be in need of minor repairs, or there may be a minor buildup of dirt or manure in the facility. Unacceptable would be slick flooring or no non-slip flooring. Gates, fences, or chutes are in need of major repairs, or that there's a major buildup of dirt or manure in the areas. Notice that nowhere in this list or description of these facilities does it say that a facility has to be new and state-of-the-art. We're talking about functional and in good state of repair. Water troughs. We're out in the pens now looking at the water troughs and the conditions of the pens. What we will look at is we'll evaluate 10 waterers randomly across the yard in pens. We'll rate those waters as acceptable or unacceptable. And at least 80% of the waters that are checked must be rated acceptable. Once again, what's an acceptable water? What's an unacceptable water? Acceptable is that water in the trough is clear and in an adequate supply. There may be a minor buildup of algae growth in the water. There may be a minor accumulation of feedstuffs or other foreign matter in the water. Unacceptable would be that water in the trough is murky, unclear, or in an inadequate supply, that there's a major growth and buildup of algae in the water, or that there's a major accumulation of feedstuffs or other foreign materials in that water. Why is this a concern from an animal well-being standpoint? Well, these may contribute to the transmission of disease or creation of food safety concerns in the animals. It may affect the palatability and acceptability of the water for cattle. Water intake and feed intake are intimately related. If there's something that is suppressing water intake by the cattle, will tend to suppress feed intake by the cattle and affect performance and well-being of those animals. An adequate supply of water. Once again, if there's not an adequate supply, cattle can't consume enough, we may affect performance through feed intake issues. Okay, we've evaluated the waters in the pens. Now we're going to look at the feed bunks. Again, we walk through the yard, go across the yard, and we evaluate 10 feed bunks across the yard randomly. We rate the bunks as acceptable or unacceptable. 80% of the bunks must be rated acceptable to pass. What's an acceptable feed bunk? Well, the feed bunk is clean and free of foreign matter. There's no mold or spoiled feed present in the feed bunk. There's no dirt, mud, or manure buildup in the feed bunk. What's unacceptable? Mold and or spoiled feed present in the bunk, dirt, mud, or manure buildup in the feed bunk. Rarely do I see a problem with these except in our hospital pens. Where I've seen problems in feed yards would be in our hospital pens. And this goes for the waters that we talked about previously. Most of the time if I see a water that's rated unacceptable, a lot of times it will be in our hospital pens. And we would hope in our hospital pens those would be the cleanest waters and cleanest feed bunks, since that's where we're trying to rehab and have animals recover from a disease problem. Why are these a concern? Once again, transmission of disease or some food safety concerns might be related to how our feed bunks are managed. Palatability and acceptability of the feed. Our business in the feed yard is to present feed to cattle, have them consume that feed, and efficiently turn it into a food product. So feed palatability and acceptability is very important. Once again, feed intake is equal to performance and health of the animals. While we're in the pens, we'll rate pen conditions, and this we'll look at mud scores. Again, we look at 10 pens across the yard. This time we're looking at the mud on the cattle. We're not necessarily looking at the floor of the pen, we're looking at the cattle. We'll rate the cattle as acceptable or unacceptable, and 80% of the pens rated must be acceptable in order to pass. What's acceptable? We look out across the pen and there's clean animals throughout the pen. Or there may be minor mud present on the legs and the knees of the animals. Or there may be some minor mud present on the belly of the animal. What's unacceptable? Mud caked on the belly of the animals, mud caked on the sides of the animals, for animals struggling to walk through deep mud present in the pens. Again, why is this of concern from an animal well-being standpoint or even a food safety? Potential for transmission of food safety concerns at slaughter. If there's mud caked on the outside of the animals, and once they reach the processing facility, as the hide is removed from those animals, there's a higher probability that some of that mud could end up on the carcass, which either ends up with trim loss on the carcass, or if it's bad enough, may actually end up with condemnation of the entire carcass. From an animal well-being standpoint, excessive mud may represent excessive stress on the cattle and a loss of performance and potentially health problems. Again, possible solutions to this would be better pen maintenance, development of mounds in the pens during times of the year when mud or rain and snow may be of concern. So to close, then, if we look at best practice protocols that affect animal well-being, we talked about personnel training in the processing and handling of animals, good pen maintenance, proper euthanasia procedures, proper handling of non-ambulatory cattle, the use of driving aids as we handle cattle, chute scoring to look at footing, focalization of the cattle, looking at our chute and head catch operations on how those work in terms of extra stress on the cattle or potential injury for the animals, and then pen space requirements as that may affect performance of the animals. That completes our discussion and review of the Texas Cattle Feeders Association Beef Safety and Quality Assurance Program, where we covered the issues dealing with food safety, issues dealing with quality control of cattle and feedstuffs and other practices in the feed yard, and cattle care and handling practices that should be implemented in the feed yard. I hope this was of assistance to you to help you appreciate better the efforts that we are going to in our feed yard industry, and help you as a potential employee of the feed yard, if that's your goal in life, to perhaps understand some of the requirements that the managers and staff may put upon you as an employee.